Tonight, we get the privilege of hearing from a very special guest. And now I know it's sometimes it feels kind of funny to have like a politician speak at a church, but Nika is a friend and a believer before she is a politician, and I think she would tell you that herself. And we are so excited to hear from her because not only is she involved in politics, but she has had a lifetime of history working and fighting for justice and understanding how does a person of faith integrate into what's happening in the world today, especially as you guys know it with what's been happening this summer and into this year. How do we respond? So there are Christians in here, there are non-Christians in here. Oh yeah, we got that. Thank you. It's all good. I'm so sorry. We got Christians, we got non-Christians, we got Republicans, Democrats, we got everything in here. But what's really, really exciting is that we can be united in this space. And I think that is what Jesus prayed for in John 17 as he prayed for his people, that we would be united, even amongst our differences. And I think every single person in this room, whatever you believe, you can say that I truly stand for justice in this world, justice in this place. Sorry, I was still unmuted. I'm so bad with technology. So without any further ado, can we just give a huge hand, a huge welcome to our friend, Nika Elugardo, Star Representative. Woo, okay. Nika, you're going to be able to see everybody kind of, not really like this, but you guys can see her up there. She can see us down here.
Kika's muted. I can't hear what's happening.
Nika, I'm so bad at this.
There you go. Okay.
But I just introduced you.
Oh, okay. Hi.
They're all laughing at me now. Can you believe this?
That's good.
But Nika, we're so excited to have you here. And the floor is yours.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for turning around so I could see you. So I don't know, Kika probably told you when I couldn't hear him that I'm Consuela's mom and Philip's mother-in-law. Some of you will know them as members. And it's an honor for me to be able to speak to you. So I was asked to talk about what we can do about racism and what Christians can do about racism. I know not everybody present is a believer at this time. But I want to start out by saying, there's a lot of things I've never been or experienced that shape my thinking about racism, and that some of you have experienced that may shape your thinking about it. So I have blind spots, like we all do. So I've never been Arab. I'm African American. I've never been a first generation Asian. Living in a white suburb, for example. I've never had to translate for my parents in a situation where I felt like they were being treated unfairly or like they were less brilliant than they are because English is only their like sixth or seventh language and not their first language, as I know happens a lot in America. I've never been an African immigrant who has experienced severe prejudice because African Americans can also be ethnocentric, American-born African Americans. So there's just a lot of things going on in all of our lives that we experience. I've never been in a community where whiteness was elevated or valued higher than Blackness, like a part of a community. Like obviously I'm in a country where that's the case, like we all are. But I didn't grow up in families and churches where whiteness was elevated. So Blackness was always put on equal ground or sometimes elevated, actually. And so a lot of things that you experience are going to be unique lenses. Some of you might, like me, have come from communities that are really low income, communities where drugs and sexual violence are part of life, sometimes even in your home. And many of you may never have experienced that. And so these types of intersections also matter. People are coming at from a lot of different angles in their own identities and orientation. People are coming from different angles in their gender, and so I just want to put that out there as an example of how to not make assumptions that what I know tells the whole story, but also as a way of inviting everyone in the room to step in to the stories that I'm going to tell about my life and to see like where you feel similarities or differences in your story or in the story of others. And for white people in particular, um, where is your story invisible and where do you have blind spots? So before I go into talking about, I think stories is a really good way to start dismantling structural racism and any kind of racism. I just want to make a couple of sort of ground rule points. These are sort of contextual statements that I'm going to make about, what I think about racism, what it is and what it isn't. Okay, just so that you can take it or leave it, but at least you know where I'm coming from. So first of all, race is a construct. So it's something created by humans. It doesn't exist. It's not genetic. Some of you may have seen those old videos from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s where kids in a science class who look all different colors of the rainbow make guesses at who in the class is going to be the most genetically similar to them. And most of them think it's the people that are the closest to their skin color, their eye color, their hair texture. But there isn't that correlation. So the more genetically similar people might, so one white Jewish kid might be very genetically similar to an African American kid, or any insert your ethnicities. So many of you will already know that, but I just want to make sure we all, at least for this hour, are on the same page about that. So race is a construct. It's something that people have made up. You could liken it to like if we said blue-eyed people are a certain type of a race. That's the equivalent of picking like a skin tone to say that it's a race. Like it doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, it's real because we have imbued it with reality. Number two, racism isn't about a comparison of suffering, right? So that's one of the reasons I highlighted a couple of other stories right in the beginning that aren't even my stories, that are stories of my friends and loved ones, because we all have suffering to different degrees. For many of us, that is tied to either colorism or race or racism. For some of us, other things, as I mentioned. But it's not about figuring out who's suffering the most and helping them or whatever, that type of thing. So, for example, if we look at COVID disparities, so most of you will be aware that, for COVID, when we looked at healthcare in the beginning, when we looked at the vaccine rollout, when we looked at the way that personal protective equipment, PPE, and different resources that the government was responsible for rolled out, there are now well-documented disparities by race. But that doesn't mean that it was done well for anyone. So something that people often forget is when you say there's a disparate impact by race, very often white people are also getting a raw deal. But the idea is that we need to make the policies better for everyone and make sure that to the degree that things aren't being done well, they're not being done worse because of your zip code or the color of your skin or your gender or other types of identity, right? Even religion in some cases. And so it's not a comparison, it's an intersection, right? To say like, okay, if I'm poor and living in a rural community, there are certain things that are going to be unfairly limited for me just because of how I was born. And then if I'm also Black, then that's probably going to be all of that plus whatever comes with being Black. And if my skin is very dark and if I'm male, then there's going to be more stuff like that. And if I'm female, there's going to be different, more stuff, right? So that's all just kind of background that I think a lot of people know, but I think it's important to think about that in the beginning of any conversation where we're talking about dismantling racism and what to do about it, to really have that breadth of understanding of what we're even talking about. Another example of race and racism not being about a comparison of suffering is if you take a look at the issue of mass incarceration. So that's the idea that America over incarcerates people. We have like many times more incarcerated people than any other I don't like saying developed country, but wealthier countries that have the resources. We put people in jail for stupid stuff. We criminalize everything, and that is across the board regardless of race. But if you look at the same types of infractions, the same types of behaviors, and you control for all of that, Black and Latinx and American Indian folks are incarcerated, arrested, stopped a lot more than white people. And that is structural racism. It happens even when law enforcement officials are not white, right? It has to do with how we perceive crime, criminology, and how we perceive people and who's suspicious and who's not, okay? So like, for example, when you just look at youth, I think all youth are over incarcerated in America. They get sent to jail for stupid crap. But Black youth are 5 times more incarcerated than white youth. American Indian are 3 times more, and Latinx 42% more incarcerated. And there are lots of studies too that sort of you control for lots of things, and it is race. It's not anything else. Even when you control for poverty, these disparities exist. So we are comparing for the purposes of understanding how things get layered on and intersected, but not as like a judgment of one suffering versus another suffering. And I think that's an important non-threatening space to create so that a diverse group of people can come forward and listen to each other's stories. And the last sort of like academic-y thing I'm gonna say, I'm trying to keep it pretty casual, is we're not really talking about just animus. So animus is when you really don't like somebody or you hate someone. So that's a kind of racism. Like I hate people because they're brown or Black, or I hate only poor Black people, or I only hate Black people in this particular town or part of town or whatever. That is racism, yes. But structural racism is when institutions have been developed and policies have been developed. So institutions like schools or courts or employers or housing agencies or banks that are giving home loans or business loans have been developed in such a way that how they do business has the impact of disproportionately shutting people out based on their race, whether or not they have that intent. So if you take a look at, for example, in Boston, they took a look at real estate transactions. And they did a little expose where folks would try to sell their home to certain real estate agencies. And the real estate agencies would give them a price, like, okay, your home is worth $500,000. And they tried to keep it, equal and make it very scientific. They did a good job of that. And Black people's homes were being priced a lot lower than white people's homes. And that meant that when they sold their homes, they weren't getting as much money. And so you may have heard about redlining and other similar things. So whether or not the person doing that is knowing that they're doing it or doing it on purpose or has any animus, maybe they are Black or maybe they were raised by Black people, it doesn't even matter. What matters in structural racism is the impact. And this is a really important thing when we transition to talking about what the church can do. So even though I'm going to talk about my personal stories and suggest that the first thing you can do is not allow anybody else's story to be invisible, but to really know the people around you and to know what the suffering is like and what's going on. Um, but at the end of the day, it's not only about what we individually do in our hearts to open our hearts and embrace and support others. It's also about challenging institutions to analyze exactly what it is and how they're set up that systematically can shut some people out of opportunities based on what they look like or their gender or other dynamics. So enough of the kind of like, glasses on bit. I have to keep my glasses on for health reasons, but pretend I'm taking my smart people glasses off. That's a stereotype. I'm just going to go with it. And I want to tell you just a few stories of how I have experienced racism, which I can't really see what anybody looks like in this particular light. But if there are people whose skin is brown or who are African American, particularly if you were born and raised here, some of these stories will not be unusual to you, especially if you're like over 25 or even just a young person who grew up in urban areas. So I'm just going to tell maybe like 3 or 4 quick examples, or maybe 5. We'll see how time goes. So, when I was in the 2nd grade, I went to an elementary school. I went to like 8 different elementary schools and middle schools because we had to move a lot. We got evicted a lot. There was a lot going on. But one of the schools I went to, there was a principal who literally beat Black children. So I'm 47, I'm about to be 48. So this is like around 1979, 1980, before some of you were born, but not like ancient history, right? After the civil rights movement and all that. And I remember coming in to from recess and wondering where this little boy was who had been sent to the principal's office because I had heard that the principal beat up Black kids. And he comes limping in like 20 or 30 minutes after the recess bell. It turned out his ribs were broken because the principal had body slammed him. This principal had also hit a Black little girl in the eye and given her a black eye. That was actually the last thing he did before people finally decided to deal with him legally. But even for myself, there was a time when, I don't know how many of you know tetherball, the game tetherball, where you have like a ball on a string. And yeah, thank you. There's a hand raising, very good. And you hit it around a pole and somebody else tries to hit it the other way until it wraps all the way around the pole. So we're playing this game on recess, me and about 10 other little girls in the 2nd and 3rd grade. And this school has only African American kids and very poor white kids who had migrated to Ohio, where I grew up, from Appalachia, which is the poorest part of our country, or one of the poorest parts of our country. And so we're all super poor. So this little girl has a watch and she got it for her birthday. And it was like a prized possession. It was probably like a $3 watch that came out of like a gumball machine. But to us, it was like rich stuff. And so she was asking everybody to hold it while she played tetherball so that it wouldn't get broken. And in all of that commotion, it got lost. So the principal calls everyone who has held that watch into his office. So there were maybe 8 or 9 of us. And he's just going on and on about stuff, whatever. I'm not really listening because I'm like 7. And then finally he's like, okay, you, and you go back to your rooms. The rest of you stay here. And I'm trying to figure out, why did they get to leave and we didn't? And my little head is turning and turning. And then finally he comes out of mwah, 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 which is all I'm hearing. And then I hear the words, we know you people like to steal. And then I'm thinking like, you people. And I look around and I realize all the white girls have gone and all the Black girls are still in the room. And I just blurt out in the middle of whatever he's saying next, are you saying Black people steal? And he didn't like me blurting that out. So he sends the rest of the girls out. And in these days, you were allowed to paddle people with a big wooden paddle at school. And this sadistic man had his paddle hanging in his grandfather clock in a little window. And he went behind his desk and sat down in his chair and told me to go get his paddle. because he was going to teach me about talking back. And I said no, because I knew what happened to kids that got anywhere close to him. And he said, you know, you bring me that paddle or I'm going to call your father and tell your father that you're a bad girl in school. And I know you're a good student. You don't want that. And then that made a little bell go off in my head. And so I'm like, yeah, call my dad, because I think you should tell him that you think Black people steal. And at this point, my dad's like a 27-year-old ex-Navy, pretty big Black man. And I guess the principal thought better of giving my dad a call under the circumstances. And he sent me back to my room. Eventually, the man was prosecuted, and I don't know what happened. But so many children suffered under him. And there were a lot of racist teachers in the school as well, who didn't like me just because I was a smart kid. I remember teachers getting angry with me when I would get answers right. And so that's like pretty direct, right? And then there was a whole other group of teachers that were anti-racist. And I later found that out. Fast forward to, you know, I'm in private school and, you know, I'm taking some extra math class, trigonometry or something. And that teacher's like, you know what? You should take the math level 2 exam, which in the 80s and early 90s was like the highest level exam you take to get into college, to colleges that require like very strong math. And I was like, I'm going to Ohio State. Like, I don't know why you think I need to do that. Anyway, she really thought I should. So I went to the guidance counselor and I said, hey, my math teacher wants me to take the math level 2 exam, you know, and I'm an A student in math. And this teacher says, that's going to be a waste of your time. I'm not going to give you that application. This is before internet, kids. So you had to get the application from your guidance counselor, or like send somebody like a handwritten letter or a typed letter for them to send it to you. And she wouldn't give it to me. And I asked her why not. And she said, it'll be a waste of time. You're not going to go to any college that requires a high level of math. And I said, even though I had also been thinking that, I didn't tell her that. I said, how do you know that? This is the first time we've met. And my math teacher sent me to you. So she reiterated that I was wasting her time and mine. And so I searched her office until I found that application. And I put everything back. I was a good kid, but I was still pissed. And I took the application. I applied on my own. I took the exam. I aced it. And I got into MIT, Cornell, and some other places, and ended up going to MIT because there were other people counterbalancing her in my life. But if it had been up to her, she would have shut me down right there. And if I was one, instead of being 1 in 100 or 1,000 kids that has a huge support network, if I was the other 99 out of 100 Black kids that was just like, oh, okay, I believe what my guidance counselor says, or I don't want to deal with this, or I'm not obnoxious enough to like make a scene, or whatever it is, you know, I wouldn't have actually been eligible to apply for MIT. And I didn't even know that, right, until much later. And so there are people who are in place in institutions who their personal animus or ignorance can actually impact dozens and hundreds of lives. Happy to say that was her first and last year teaching at that school as a guidance counselor. Even here when I came to Boston, I should say that type of incident happened to me multiple times in high school. I could tell you a number of stories where people said to me, either directly or indirectly, people like you don't belong here. One teacher even told me, kids in your name, I said, everybody should have this kind of education, this private school education. It shouldn't be the purview of the elite. And she said, the kids in your neighborhood would ruin this school. And I was like, I'm the only kid you've ever met from my neighborhood. Am I ruining this school? And then she yelled at me in French. It was a French class. So like that kind of stuff was going on all the time. Come to MIT, and you know, I had to pay my way. I had to pay for my plane tickets, everything. So I worked. And with some of the money that I made when I worked, I would occasionally go buy gifts for my younger sisters. And on one such occasion, actually on a couple of such occasions, I was kicked out of the mall. I was kicked out of a restaurant. I was kicked out of the mall again. for just sitting around with my friends after having spent over $100, which was a lot for me in 1991 teenager dollars, on my siblings. The last time somebody tried to kick me out, the third time, and my friends, all of us were black and brown, and I said to that security guard, this is the third time this has happened to me in Boston. I'm not leaving until you tell me what the reason is. And eventually I pressed him and he said, you see that guy up there? It was one of those guys that used to wear the wires in their ears with the suits, like super security at the mall. He said, he told me to kick you guys out because rich people come in here all the time and they don't want to see you here. And I hate to tell you that because I don't feel that way, but this is my job. And so those types of experiences are the most benign that a lot of Black people experience in this country. I've had friends who their sister was raped by the police. I've had friends who have been dragged by police and school officials. I've had relatives who were expelled from school in the 2nd grade because they were acting out in class after their father was shot and somebody dragged them to see the bullet in his head. And so these compounding realities where like you're already suffering and struggling because of poverty and other reasons, and people are just pressing you down. So what can we do about that? Well, the list goes on. My dad has so many struggles because when he was 15, he was brutally beaten by the KKK, and the people that beat him were men that he trusted, bosses that he worked with. And you would never know that by talking to my dad. You would never know by talking to me, what I've seen or been through. And there are many more stories. The more educated I get, the more money I get, the less people treat me that way. But even still, I get the same things that some of you might get when you walk into a store and people question your right to be there, or any kind of institution, really. So as Kika mentioned, I did hear this before he cut out, I am an elected official. And I've been elected for this is my 3rd year now. And so I'm very interested in analyzing policy to see, well, what is it in the way that we do education that does not provide equal education under the law? Where are we funding wealthy white schools actually more than we're funding other schools? Where is the budget not being met? Or we're giving more money, but the need is greater because 90% of the kids there are in poverty and 30% are homeless. So looking at these types of policy problems is one approach, and it's an important one. But the church and Christians, non-Christians, I don't care who you are, you can't do anything about racism without first looking in your own heart. Even I, as a Black woman who has experienced a variety of types of racism, some more extreme and less extreme than the stories I've shared, I have had to look at my own heart to see where I have internalized oppression. And the only way to really tackle that is to be transparent about our stories and to be all about listening to other people's stories, even maybe more eager than we are to share our own. So, I could tell stories all day and all night, and maybe we'll have more engagements, or maybe some of you I'll see in other settings, and we can swap stories. But racism really has impacted all of us. And we can't accept the lie that people of color, BIPOC people, Black people, are experiencing oppression because of them. We are experiencing it because of our collective agreement to dehumanize some people. And even when they experience a disparate impact, to accuse them of wrongdoing instead of to take ownership for ourselves and on behalf of the institutions that we represent and are part of. So the question I want to leave you with is, for those who are believers, redemption is a really big part of our story. So, God has redeemed every single bad story that I've told you and the ones that I haven't in my life. And that's something that we have to offer and also to experience in the faith. as the word says, the Lord will restore the years the locusts have eaten. And that means that when we come vulnerably and honestly before God, ready for him to dismantle our own conceptions of self-worth or what makes us successful, to recognize if like whiteness or white likeness is part of that, and to let it be stripped from us and replaced with a God-centered and human-centered understanding of equality before God of all people. What does redemption have to offer? And what in particular does redemption with repentance have to offer? And not only repentance and redemption on our own behalf, but as Christ has modeled for us, what does it look like to do repentance and redemption over racism, structural and otherwise, on behalf of others, on behalf of our families, on behalf of our cities, our towns, our schools, our churches, and our nation? Questions?
Hey, Nika.
Hey.
Just want to say thank you, first of all. Questions? Okay. Oh, yeah.
My question is to you, with the current polarity in our nation, the political climate, how do you suggest that we work together and learn to listen instead of just speak? Because I feel like so much, like especially in my university, a lot of us just speak and no one really listens. So what is your advice to empathize more and to understand more the differences between us? Thank you.
That's a really great question. I think, not to be overly stereotypical about youth, but it has been my experience, at least in this region, that people under 25 seem more eager and ready to drop the politicization of things. I don't know if I said that word right, but when you make things about politics versus about human beings, obviously there's going to be like 30, 40, whatever percent, like some substantial percentage of people that are going to be all about Republican, left, right, blah, 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 Democrat. But for a lot of young people, and I also identify with this, although I used to be alone in the 80s talking like this, we reject the idea that we can be defined by a political spectrum. And I think that's actually a real blessing for the question that you have raised, because it creates a platform for people to express their identity on an equal footing with each other, and to not feel that they have to be pinned down to a particular set of policies. And so I would say, number one, resist doing that, because even though I do think it is something special about this generation that they naturally resist being put in a box in a lot of different ways, including politically, I do notice that as people are turning 24, 25, 26, they start solidly sinking into those boxes, right? And they can only be like hyper left like me, or they could only be conservative. Things about the Bible and the Word and the Spirit of God is that He has designed all of us and each of us to express various aspects of who God is. And sometimes we hate the things that are very different than what we know or understand. And so, first is like resist the politicization of things. But second is don't let the emotional state that we have around another person control how we treat that person. It's okay to feel anger, hate, irritation, confusion. But instead of trying to correct, try to understand. More people are going to be able to talk to each other if all parties are seeking to understand the other. So something that somebody told me is consider curiosity instead of challenge, because I'm really good at like challenge and critique. So like I'm all set on that. And so really pressing into being curious. Oh, tell me more why you think that. An example of that is there was a group of legislators, very conservative, all white men, who were against our motion last session to fully fund public education in a way that gave double funding to schools that had systemic poverty, so where they were in the bottom 10% of poorest schools in the district, because things are just more expensive when the kids are dealing with structural poverty. And I was assigned to talk to like the hardest nuts to crack, because they were going to vote no on this particular aspect of the bill. And so I walked around with a piece of paper that had like a little bit of my story of how education had empowered me to like be there with them as their colleague, and how everybody deserved that. But then I asked them, why do you think it's unfair for impoverished schools that have mostly impoverished families to have more funding to deal with those needs? And they explained, and I was like, oh, okay. Did you know that in my district, which is a median district, it's not a poor district, 2 of my best schools, between 20 and 30% of the kids are homeless at some point in the year. And I looked up your district, and I see that your median income is $125,000. Mine is 66, which is just like average. And in the town where you live, it's even higher. It's 150. So when your schools, I'm going to guess maybe like 5%, not 95% of the kids are poor, and you might get 1 or 2 homeless kids in a year. And they were like, yeah, that's right. I'm like, so what do you think your school can do to absorb the kids who have struggles related to poverty that a school where all the kids are coming with that can't do? And they start listing things like, oh my gosh. Well, first of all, this is really funny, not funny type of thing. 3 different guys, well, 2 of them were together, but 3 different guys said, when I said homeless, they said, what do you mean homeless? I'm like, homeless means homeless, dude. Like, they don't have anywhere to live. And he's like, well, how do they study? One guy said, and another guy was like, where do they sleep? I couldn't believe this. These are like full grown 50, 40 somethings. And they're asking these questions because they literally have never had a conversation where they could ask the question. And they really literally didn't know. So we went on with that conversation, and I explained, they're sleeping in cars, they're sleeping in shelters, whatever. And they start listing all the stuff that my schools need that their schools don't. Even stuff I never thought about, like a washer and a dryer to facilitate kids who aren't able to come with their clothes already cleaned. And I was like, that's a great idea. That costs money. It ended up being a unanimous vote, right? I wasn't the only person doing conversations like that. And these are hardcore like Tea Party Republicans, and I'm like a leftist. Not as left as they come, because I do believe in capitalism as a thing that should exist. But pretty left because I also believe in socialism and that they should coexist. And we agreed on that. All 160 state representatives ultimately agreed. And that's why for the first time in Massachusetts history, our schools will be fully funded in 7 years. So we're taking 7 years to implement it. So you do it by just getting into those conversations and being a listener yourself. And however people say stuff, it might make you feel a certain way, but don't judge them. You can acknowledge in your mind that you think it's wrong or right without judging the person as not being a good person or worthy of your ear. I hope I answered your question, because I have like 100 more things to say about it that I didn't. So I'm sure I like packed way too much into the answer, but I hope at least I gave you some ideas you can use. Into silence. So dig deep and find something to say, even if it's just a comment or like a man, that sucks, that shouldn't have happened, or whatever. I don't know.
Check. I think it's working. No, we're good.
Are you unmuted? What do you prioritize? Like, what's the thing you feel like you need to fix first? Because like obviously there's like education, police reform. What do you feel like is the first thing that you want to, or if you could fix something like right now, what would be the first thing it would be?
I would say housing stability. So I think of the 3 pillars of dismantling poverty, which is another thing that is actually structurally produced by our policies, are housing, education, and healthcare. So everything else, like jobs and starting a business and all that stuff, like you can't do it if you're not healthy, and if you don't have a place to live, you can never be healthy. The reason I pick housing, even though like you can't really separate those things, they're really integrated. And we have immigration and climate change, which are actually problems because we're making them problems versus like problems that we have historically had. So all that stuff is super interconnected with a long list of other things. But housing is an area where we systematically accept that 4 out of 5 people who need affordable housing won't have it. And that number is growing instead of shrinking, that percentage. So, you know, I was talking to a state leader and they were like, yeah, we got to get that down to 3 out of 4. That mindset is poisonous, because what we don't realize is what you're saying is three out of 4 people who need housing won't have it. Like, and so we got to start thinking differently about housing, where public and affordable housing is an investment, and tenants and low-income homeowners are investors. And we expect them to get a return on their investment so that we're creating generational wealth because of asset development. You know, an asset is something that you own that has value, like a car or a house, or a degree can even be considered that. So right now, you probably are aware that housing prices are crazy and skyrocketing, both for rents and for homeownership. And you can't just sprinkle a few programs here and there and solve that. Like, we really have to tackle it full on. And there's no other area where you could say more disproportionately by race other than the criminal justice system, where you see generational poverty being perpetuated by our systems. So Boston did a study and found that the average wealth of a white Bostonian is $250,000. The average wealth of an African-American Bostonian is $8. And then they looked at all these other people groups, and the other people groups ranged from $0 for certain immigrants from certain countries to about $250. And a lot of that has to do with their ability to invest in housing generationally and to pass that down, and to the lack of access to the housing market historically and today. So that's my thing. But I'm like super, I co-sponsored last session 400, actually because of COVID, we did some extra 637 bills. So like, I'm big on supporting other people's priorities too, but I'm picking housing because it's one that there aren't really enough legislators who are working on right now.
Okay, follow-up question. Can I ask one? I know I'm like Kika, but
Hi, Kika.
Okay. I love it.
about hearing others and what others are saying, and like don't let anyone's story be invisible. What else can I do like practically to make injustice, whether it's like social injustices or just like day to day, everyday kind of thing? Does that make sense? Yeah.
When is Consuela, can you wave? I can't see where you are. Hey. I remember when Consuela was like a sophomore or a junior, and I heard some kids from the Arabic church talking about applying to college or signing up for SATs or something like that. And they were talking about whether they were going to check whether they were white or whether they were going to check something else because like their actual identity was not listed. And, you know, somebody started saying like, oh, well, I'll get more scholarships if I check this or that. And then there was a similar conversation that I heard happening around the same time from some of her white friends from her high school. And the way they were talking about Black people and Blackness, I felt very dehumanized by it. But because I was like the mom of a 15-year-old that I didn't want to embarrass, I didn't say anything to them. I said something to Consuela later. When you're in those kinds of conversations, you need to either check yourself or check your friends. Not that they shouldn't be saying that stuff, but thinking more broadly about what does it mean? What responsibilities do we have if our skin is brown and Black? Nobody can put them on us, but what responsibilities do we want to have? To speak up for the people who are not present in the car, in the room, and to recognize when we're kind of like dehumanizing people as just like a category. And I know that the types of language and conversations that happen about Black people are worse when I'm not in the room. And I don't know that high schoolers have changed that much in the last 10 years. And I was surprised that they hadn't changed more from the time that I was in high school too. And if you're Black, you know, I hear a lot of African Americans shooting down immigrants or stereotyping them or laughing at them. Don't stand for that stuff. Speak up. And if you're not comfortable speaking up in the form of like, I'm going to say something right now, just in a chill way that feels like it'll work or in a forceful way or whatever, find a way to talk to somebody, email, text, whatever you're doing, send somebody a picture or an article, whatever, but keep each other on your toes. Because I know a lot of folks my age and in their 30s who are out there fighting for civil rights and Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and they say some super racist stuff when they're joking around. And those mindsets really minimize what we're able to do and with legitimacy when we try to make real change. Then I would also say, like, get involved in organizations that are meaningful to you. And they don't have to have a race tag or a BLM, Black Lives Matter movement tag to them. So those are easy to find online. But volunteer as a big brother, big sister. Go volunteer with youth at a public housing development nearby. When you're making your housing decisions, don't choose to live where you're going to be isolated around from the problems that other people have to endure. Live near or among them, or go be part of the communities that you know are experiencing structural racism and oppression by just hanging out there. Walk your dog there. Spend time in communities getting to know the old grannies and the abuelitas. And if you speak other languages, speak to people in their language, even if you're not good at it, you know, and take your parents, take your friends, build meaningful relationships in the communities that are struggling, and they will tell you what needs to get done and how you can help. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you guys can put this in the chat if people answer it later. It's like 9:15. I'm going to let you go. But I'm really curious to know, not what I said that was great or impactful, but was there anything that I said that sort of hurt or seemed confusing or made you feel uncomfortable? If you guys write that stuff up or text it to Kika and send it to me, I will write back to you.
Well, Nika, thank you so much. We
Next time I'll come and be in person, and probably by then we won't need masks. So that'll be awesome.
Hey, awesome. Well,
Much love, everybody. Blessings.